Well, welcome to Bodies in the Clouds. I am Wendy Grossman. I am the panel chair, I guess. Congratulations on finding your way to Area 42. People first or introduction first? People first. Yeah. With us, we have our moderator, Lucie Krahulcova, who organized the panel. Lucie is an independent, no, she's not. She's the EU policy analyst at Access Now. Next to her is Łukasz Olejnik, an independent security and privacy researcher and consultant, and a member of a W3C architecture group member. You got to get all those words in exactly the right direction, right order, or they're wrong. On his left is Ailidh Callander, who is a legal officer at Privacy International, where she works on data protection advocacy. And next to her is Chris Gao, who is the head of EU public policy for the government affairs team at CISCO, where he plays an active role on spectrum, cloud, and IoT policy. And next to her is Leone Tanza, who is a research associate at the EPSRC-funded PETRAS Internet of Things Research Hub, where she is part of the hub's standards, governance, and policy stream. And last, all the way on the left, is Anna Maria Fimin, a policy officer for the Internet of Things at DG CNECT. And we're here to talk about bodies in the clouds. It turned out not to mean exactly what I thought it would. I first thought of Andrea Matushin's discussion of the Internet of Bodies. But actually, we're talking more about the digital shadow that we all have, sort of our digital persona up in the cloud somewhere, which may or may not be like us. And to explain the background of that, in the early days, we used to talk about cyberspace as a separate place. And I think there were two reasons why it made sense at the time. The first is that you had to dial up and wait to get there. Modems had to mate in the snow with the moonlight. And you know, it felt like you were going somewhere different. And when you got there, the people you met were not people you knew in your real life. So whatever you did online felt like it had no consequences for your real life. And so it made sense to talk about it as cyberspace, a different place. It's sort of like English people going on vacation in Benidorm is my typical description. And today that's changed. Now continuous connections sort of follow us all around. I'm on broadband at home. I've got my phone with me. I don't have to ever be. Cyberspace is not something I'm ever away from. And the people we meet online are more often our friends and family. We spend much less time, well, the sane ones of us spend much less time talking to strangers and much more interacting with people that are in our real lives. But there is still something of a boundary. You know when you pick up your phone that you're accessing something that is not not physically present. You know when you go to Facebook or you go to Wikipedia that you have crossed into cyberspace in some way. But nonetheless, by 2013, you had the New America Foundation founder, Michael Lind, saying that cyberspace was such a dumb idea, you could feel yourself getting stupider the minute you thought of it. And I kind of resent that on behalf of the old net, but I get his point. This is increasing, of course, with things like Fitbits and Apple Watches and things that we don't necessarily take off that track us through physical space. And the way I've described this in the last few years is to say that cyberspace is invading real life. The sensors we have are building a kind of hybrid cyber-physical system where the things we interact with and our online persona are becoming linked. Google, for example, I have an Android phone, it's not really very hard for somebody to say, she reads the same 2 blogs on her phone that she reads on this desktop. It's very easy to see that it's the same person. It's very much like detectives when they are looking for someone who has disappeared. They look for things like, have they registered, has somebody answering to their description registered for a fishing license in any other state? Because people may change their wives, their lives, their jobs, and their homes and still keep their hobbies. And so there are lots of ways that our physical lives can actually be linked to our online personas that formerly were quite separate. And I think there are some really interesting questions beginning to appear. For example, if I visit a friend and he has an Amazon Echo, and he has signed the privacy policy for the Amazon Echo, well, what's my relationship in this? Do I have to sign a privacy policy to enter his house? Is the Echo somehow prevented from collecting anything I say to him? And how do I make it work when he's gone to bed? And we're seeing the data collected by the Amazon Echo is already being used in murder trials. There was a case in the States, and there was more recently one in Germany where investigators used the Apple app belonging to the suspect to reenact what they thought happened the night of the crime and compare the results in the app. It was a health app, like the heart rate and the steps and so forth. Compare that to the data that the app had actually collected on that night in order to make their case against this suspect. In security, when we talk about the Internet of Things, the first thing we say is that legacy manufacturers do not understand the change in the threat model that happens when you add wireless connections. And we've seen this with things like keyless car entry systems, which have been hacked and shown to be completely inadequate. All these systems that we're building are massively more complex than the systems we've had before. And where Andrea Matuschin comes in is the Internet of Bodies as medical devices become inserted. Somebody was talking this morning about injecting a smart contact lens. And these things become part of the Internet of Things, but they're also part of our bodies. That's a very intimate link between us and cyberspace. And one of the things about this is that the laws that we have passed in this first 20 years of the Internet have really been drafted with the idea of cyberspace being at least somewhat separate. Just a few weeks ago, a relatively small American ISP sent a letter to one of their subscribers warning them that if they continued to attract complaints about copyright infringement, their bandwidth would be throttled. Now, there's a law that permits this to protect copyright holders. But the letter went on to warn them that this could affect devices in their house that require continuous connections. And they specifically mentioned security cameras and thermostats. Now, at the time, the northeastern United States, the average temperature was 0 Fahrenheit. Should you actually freeze to death because you like to download Game of Thrones? I mean, it seems an extreme kind of punishment. So this is kind of the state of play, is that we have these conflicts that are coming at us between, I think, the laws that we passed with one kind of imagination of the Internet, and the Internet that they're actually going to apply to is a whole different thing. And at this point, nothing I have said may have anything to do with the rest of the panel. I don't know, but I'm going to hand it over to Lucie to figure it out.
Wow, excellent. Thank you, Wendy, for this wonderful storytelling intro. I think it's good, and people need some time to wake up after lunch, so thank you all for joining us. I will hands off for a little bit. I've asked the panelists to each do a sort of 5-minute statement because I'm not sure how familiar we all are in the room with each other. So basically just to give you an intro into their work and how they approach this topic. And then I have some questions, of course, prepared, but I'm very happy to take questions or statements from the audience. So it's not just the question limited panel. If you feel like you have a little bit of an intervention, please do that. You can introduce yourself. You really don't have to. We're at a privacy conference. You do whatever you want to do. So with that, I'll hand it off to Lukáš, who will start us off. And I'll be timing, though, very diligently. So don't test me. It will be five-ish minutes.
Good afternoon. I had to rework my stance due to the recent events. So, first of all, today there's a report, FCQ report, which actually claims that every single object which is connected to electricity will be connected to network 2. Also, today we had a very nice information this morning, actually yesterday late night. So, the Dutch intelligence agency hacked advanced persistent threat group in Russia, who, for a change, hacked US elections. Now, they were able to actually link that group to, allegedly, to Russian intelligence. How did they do it? They hacked cameras in front of the buildings, and they tagged the pictures. So, imagine where everything is connected, and not only is connected, but the data is being well, let's not speak about stunts like that, but if you have everything connected and you have a system which continuously acquires this data, then it's clear that at least the visual profile in the future will be analyzed on a regular basis. Now, on the internet, thanks to the devices that we very often wear on ourselves, on the internet, not only you are able to tell that you are a dog, but you can also describe you. You can see what kind of breed it's the dog, what are the patterns of walks, what is the diet pattern, and this all comes from the actual use patterns, the life patterns, which are actually being collected and sent by those devices. So imagine web browsers and imagine devices about also common objects like vacuum cleaners. This summer we had an actual public discussion, because Roomba considered to send the mappings of houses to some external entities. Mappings of houses, of course, reveal a lot about the actual users of those houses. So this is only one object. Now, another question is who has access to this data. If, as it happens very commonly, the data is being sent to the cloud for cloud analytics, it's clear that potentially cloud providers might have access, although they provide guarantees, security and privacy guarantees. However, nobody will be able to guarantee security from, for example, law enforcement agencies. And this is a very important case here, Microsoft case, which is very famous now, and it will be in the Supreme Court, where law enforcement agencies want to access emails stored on Microsoft servers, but in Ireland. So this has usually implications. Now, my stance is that technology should be designed with the user in mind, with sane settings and sane privacy standards. I work towards that in relation to web browsers, and not sure if you are aware, but web browsers will be very powerful soon with new sensors, for example, light sensors, but also others. And this kind of information, when aggregated, might reveal additional information about the users. So how to cope with that? You can design technologies and standards well. You can also design and work on smart regulations, for example, on e-privacy regulations, which is actually something that will be perhaps the constitution of privacy protections and electronic communications. Lastly, data protection impact assessments, which should be done diligently and deeply and broadly and heavily on technologies. So you have these kind of aspects like standards, technologies, and regulations, and all should cooperate.
Wow, incredible. You were at 4.5 minutes. I'm so proud. No, perfectly on time. Yeah, it was perfect. It was perfect. What a way to start. Sorry, you guys have to pass the microphone a little awkwardly, so just make sure you're looking at where the cups are in relation to the laptops. And Ailidh, please.
Thanks. So yeah, thanks, Lucie, as well. So we're talking about these senses that are everywhere in our lives, in the streets that we walk in, and when we're exercising, in the cars that we're driving, in our workplaces, in our homes, in our friends' homes, and they're generating and collecting massive amounts of data, from which you can tell a lot about, as we know, an individual's life. Yet often we find that these devices are frequently unsafe and insecure, and also privacy invasive. And that's the thing, it's this convergence of those three problems: it's safety, security, and privacy. When you take the example of the thermostat, as Wendy mentions, you don't want it to burn down your house or allow you to freeze. You also don't want it to be hackable so someone can hold you to ransom. And you also don't want it to be leaking sensitive data about your your day-to-day life to your energy company, or also to the state. So this is something that we're concerned with at Privacy International, and we're seeking to understand and challenge what we call this data exploitation, both at a corporate and state level, and seek stronger and more effective legal protections. Most individuals don't realize when their device is on what kind of data is stored on it, who it's shared with, and where it's shared, and the consequences for them and what that might be. So over the last year, we've looked at some issues related to this, including information stored on rental cars, sensors in so-called smart cities, and also the use of connected devices in criminal proceedings as evidence, as Wendy mentioned. So just taking that last example of IoT in the courtroom, and this reliance on devices without a huge amount of debate and transparency. And there's three things that concern us there: the information asymmetry between those on trial and those who have access to that information, and that's the second problem: the unequal access to the data, and the accuracy and the reliability of that data as well. So if you as an individual don't know where the data is, you don't have the equal access, and it could be unreliable. Is that really what we want ourselves or others to be judged on? And that also includes data on devices that we maybe don't know is there, what we call data in the wings, or invisible data that police and others can access using extractive technologies such as Celebrite to take out data from mobile phones. So that's something that we're investigating. We've been investigating it in the UK through FOI requests, and we think it's vital that human rights, for protection of human rights, the individuals understand what their devices are doing, and that those that try and help them, whether it be activists or lawyers, are aware of that and understand it as well. And in that sense, we need transparency both from companies and from law enforcement. So just quickly, in terms of what are the legal protections that address some of those issues, well, data protection is one, and GDPR does offer many things. It offers its principles, it offers the individual rights, data protection by design and by default. But I think we also need to look beyond data protection. It's not a solution in terms of IoT regulation. There's not comprehensive data protection laws around the world, and it only goes so far in terms of personal data. So we also need to look to consumer protection, consider certification standards and product liability as well. So we're going to be interested to see how the new rights under GDPR play out, but also look to how rights are protected when devices are developed and produced and throughout their lifespan. And also data protection has wide exemptions for law enforcement. So and that's something we're particularly concerned about, for example, with the extraction technology. And also there's difficulties in practice. We've seen recently the great report from the Norwegian Consumer Council about watches for children, and even there where you've got that great report, there's still an uphill struggle to have products taken off the shelves. And also, finally, that governments and law enforcement do need to be transparent, as I said, just in terms of prioritizing the safety, security, and privacy of the devices, rather than focusing on backdoors, which just further serve to reinforce security and privacy concerns.
Okay, excellent. I think we might get an award at the end, actually. It might be a Cpdp first, where everyone actually sticks to right under 5 minutes. I'm very proud so far. Okay, so next, Chris, please take it away.
Thank you. So I've got 5 minutes, so I'm not going to try and tell you everything, but there's a couple of things I do want to get across in this period. One is a little bit of a picture of what's happening in the IoT space now in the next couple of years. What that means in terms of the risks for the individuals,
Sorry,
but also
Chris, Mike.
Right up.
Yeah.
But also where we should avoid pushing too far. And then most importantly, you know, how do we hold the actors involved accountable? And by the actors involved, I mean for certain the private sector and the device manufacturers, but also the government side and the law enforcement authorities. So I think, you know, Wendy, you did a great job of explaining the history of how devices have become more pervasive. And I think we all have a sense that that's the case. We have a bit of luxury inside my company in that we actually conduct research on this on an ongoing yearly basis. So I can put a bit of numbers there, right? So by 2021, we expect that there will be 27 billion connected devices around the world. And approximately half of those will be machine-to-machine connections, right? So to put that another way, there's going to be 3.5 devices for every person on this planet. Now, naturally, that means these devices, most of them are sensors, actuators. Some of them are more complex. These are going to be ubiquitous. Ailidh, you talked a little bit about it being in our home, in our work. You know, home and work alone, by the way, that's roughly half of the devices. So think your smart thermostats, your home automation, your networking equipment, building security. But it's also going to be in our cars. Think vehicle diagnostics or in you know, car entertainment. It's going to be in our healthcare settings. Think about in assisted homes. In our cities, traffic management, waste management. In retail, the payment systems. In manufacturing throughout the supply chain. And you can go on. And I think naturally that does create some risks for individuals that we have to pay attention to. Firstly, because it's so ubiquitous, it does have an impact on privacy and confidentiality. Secondly, because we're now so reliant on these devices, it has a huge security impact for us. So I think on the privacy side, we're definitely, the risk is from, let's say, irresponsible companies out there. The risk is from malicious actors who get hold of your data. And the risk is from overzealous law enforcement authorities as well. On security, I think the risk is not just actually to the devices itself that we think of as so important, but actually the interesting thing is the risk is also on a host of other devices which, or sorry, other services which these devices can be turned around to attack. So if you think of the Mirai botnet from 2016, that was a huge distributed denial of service attack, which leveraged IP cameras and routers in your home to knock out a domain name server company called DIN, which in turn knocked out a number of the favorite information security services that we use. Netflix, Twitter was impacted, Facebook, and so forth. The one note of caution I wanted to make here was around understanding confidentiality in this space, because I think we have to be aware that communication here is not always the same as communications we imagine from our phone or from social networking messaging. And so I don't think we can look at confidentiality exactly the same way here. So to put this in the context of what's happening in IoT, there's a big move towards what's called fog computing and a subset under that called edge computing. And the basic idea here is that more of the processing is taking out close to the edge of where the data is initially collected rather than back up in the cloud. Now, what does that translate to? Well, that means like a lot of this is happening during transmission, the processing. So think, simple example, if I've got a sensor, if I'm a farmer and I've got a sensor out in my in my field, which is measuring soil acidity, I'm not sending every one of those readings back up to the cloud for analysis. I'm sending maybe 1 in 100 of those readings, plus anything which is anomalous. So if you get a weird pH reading, that's what happens. And the reason I'm emphasizing this point, this is something under current discussion in the e-privacy regulation, and maybe we can come back to that. Now, for the responsibilities, on the private sector side, I think the obvious thing is that we need to apply the existing legal framework correctly and properly and astutely, whether that's GDPR or whether that's the NIST directive. But inside our company, we don't think that's quite far enough, and we're actually promoting the idea of doing an IoT trust label to try and particularize this at a more detailed level. So on the privacy side, that's pretty basic stuff like making sure that the device only collects limited amount of information, or making sure you can erase the data off the device, or in fact anything which is back up in the cloud. And the more sophisticated end, that might be encrypting the data on the device itself to prevent unauthorized access. And on the security side, it's about, you know, given this, the vast speed, the scale at which these devices are being deployed, it's trying to prevent a situation where all the security aspects fall on the device itself, and finding a way to automate this at scale. So if that's the responsibility of the private sector, on the government side, I think the point that we're going to recognize here, and what we've learned from history, is that law enforcement is most interested in the data it can pick up about your private life. So I would say the high-risk areas for us when we think about IoT is IoT in the home, and it's also IoT that can track your movement. So think about the cars and the smart city applications. I think in terms of what needs to be done here, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's the same principles which should apply to government access here as should apply everywhere. And to our mind, there's a simple set of 5. One is that the request should be made to the data owner. You know, you don't need to go to your example, Lucas, you don't need to go to Microsoft to find out the data about an individual who's using their services. The request should be made directly, either to the customer who's a corporation, or directly to the individual themselves. Secondly, we'd like those requests to be narrow in scope. We've all seen and we've all experienced very wide-ranging requests. Third, we want to be able to be transparent to our customers. No more gag orders, or if you're going to do a gag order, you better have a very good reason for it. Fourth, we need to have independent oversight and enforcement. You know, we don't want to give free reins for them to make their own rules. And fifth, and this is definitely going to come out to play in a new piece of legislation due next month, we don't want them to tamper with the device itself without our knowledge. So it's the whole debate around lawful hacking. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I think you mentioned government a couple of times, and I think this is a good panel to get those discussions and trying to whittle down of where responsibility for these different pieces falls and what kind of initiatives government can do alongside the private push. So that's great. Thanks for outlining that. So on to you, Leonie. Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Leone Tanza. I'm postdoctoral researcher in a relatively big IoT hub, which basically means we're a consortium of 9 universities in the UK. So I'm not speaking as one researcher, but behind me are basically 80 other people, plus a stakeholder group, which includes CISCO and other industry stakeholders that support this research that we're currently pursuing and doing so over the course of 3 years. And I think I can only draw on aspects that have been mentioned so far, but want to pick out a couple of points that I think are important for the discussion today. Number one is because we always speak around device, IoT as a device. And actually IoT are systems, and that is really important for these discussions because it's no longer just your fridge, and I know we all talk about the smart fridge, but actually the fridge has is a whole complex system with an application layer, a transport layer where the communication is going, the network layer, and the perception layer. Everything is important here. And the security does need to not only focus on the device level, which a lot of current discussions are which we probably hear around the certification scheme of the European Union, focused on. But actually, we really need to discuss how we ensure the security and privacy is ensured throughout that system. And I also think it's important that CISCO actually steps up here. But CISCO is just one really big corporation, but we have a lot of small startups that are struggling with how to implement security. So what we in our research see is basically that especially small SMEs struggle with the fragmented standardization landscape that is currently taking place. So if you start to come up with a new idea for an IoT system or device, however you want to call it, you need to basically figure out not just be compliant with GDPR and everything else, but also kind of what security principles you should basically implement. And that is the difficult bit, because you have perhaps a software aspect you've taken from a library somewhere, and you take a CISCO product and then buy another product from a third-party vendor, and when you put that all together, how can you ensure that you're going to be the one that persistently is able to maintain this system and device? So that's really the complication that the complexity that we're facing with IoT, and that's the reason why everybody discusses this currently. I also wanted to say a couple of things around when we talk about privacy and security, we also often focus on a specific state, but actually this starts at design level. It then goes into the maintenance level, where it's about updates that need to be kept alive, because previously you bought your toaster or your car and you thought that was the safety world that we lived in, that it was tested and it was fine and it was secure, and you knew after 2 years then the guarantee is over, and then you're left alone, but probably works for another 5 years. But now, when you buy a fridge or whatever, it basically has to be kept maintained because it's internet connected. There's a physical aspect to it and a software aspect to it. And that software is, when it's often released, not really 100% sure. And most of the time, you can't be 100% sure that it is secure, because there will be an Intel bug or whatever gonna happen. And then a last point, and I want to refer there to my colleague, Dr. John Blythe at UCL, who highlighted these aspects, is the disposal also. We also need to think about how are we gonna get rid of those devices, the data that is on them, and also the data that is being stored there. So just a couple of pointers for the discussion that I think are important to contextualize, not just the legal aspects and perhaps the perspective from a corporation, but also kind of what research is currently really challenged by. Because if I have learned one thing in the last year, it's that we've came up with more questions than sometimes answers. We try, but that's just some pointers where I think it's worth to go into more depth today. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's good to that you made that division between the physical and the software, and how to ensure especially the continuity of that for consumers. We had a similar debate the other day at a health panel, basically how to ensure the continuity for devices, something like a pacemaker, where it becomes a lot more complex than a fridge. If a fridge loses the software component, my vegetables are still going to be cold. If my pacemaker becomes obsolete, I have a big problem, financial as well as a threat to my health. So yeah, and I agree. Also, this comes back to the characterization of there are really high-risk areas for IoT, and health devices are definitely up there with what you mentioned, Chris. Okay, so Anna Maria, I'll let you continue.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Access Now, for inviting the European Commission this panel. And thank you also for bearing with us on this last panels of the Cpdp 2018. I'm here on behalf of DG Connect, which is the European Commission service, putting forward the strategy to develop the ICT sector, and among this also a strategy for Internet of Things technologies. I've been working in this field as a policy and legal officer since 2014, and I would like to highlight the fact that Internet of Things goes beyond objects that are connected to the Internet. It comes somehow, picking up the point from Leonie, the realm of Internet of Things for the European Commission is exactly the notion of communication between several objects that are connected to the Internet, and also the communication between the objects and us, of course, the people. So if we think of the smart home environment, what can we find inside? You have the smart fridge, you have the smart doors, you have the smart meters, but you also have artificial intelligence power devices like cooking robots, so on and so forth. So if these technologies prove their viability, then they will be surely enjoying a better quality of life. Of course, in order to get to the deployment of this technology, DG CONNECT, on behalf of the European Commission, is trying to build a trustful environment around these technologies. This is done, of course, within the limitation of the tools that are in our hands as public administration. So what we are doing so far, first of all, we make use of the European Commission research grants that are meant to develop the research and innovation in the field of these technologies. And for the period of 2014 and 2017, under the Horizon 2020 European Research and Innovation programs, we have invested almost 200 million euros in IoT research, and some of our calls go also towards investment in developing privacy and security solutions in the field of Internet of Things. Secondly, we work closely with the IoT stakeholders to make sure that we help towards enforcement of the acquis in relation to human rights. And for this end, we have put forward in 2015 the Alliance for Internet of Things Innovation, and we have here a distinguished member, CISCO, as well. Together with this alliance, we try to create a vibrant ecosystem around the IoT realm, encompassing all the actors of the value chain in order to streamline our activities in relation to policy, research, as well standardization and certification activities. Of course, last but not least, another tool in our hands is regulation. We are, of course, aware that we need to build an environment which enables the development of these technologies, while, of course, safeguarding consumers' rights. For this end, we already have in place the GDPR, the e-privacy directive is in the pipeline, and we believe these tools are putting forward the right principles to deal with the privacy challenges that our panelists have already highlighted. Nonetheless, we are very much aware that the enforcement of these instruments is still heavy in light of the fact that these technologies are new, and we do not really know how the realm of IoT will encompass in 2020 from now on. That is why DG CONNECT has also put forward other instruments to help with the enforcement of this privacy key. For example, this September in 2015, we have launched the Cybersecurity Act, which is a Commission proposal putting forward a certification a framework for the development of a European certification schemes, under which, as Chris already mentioned, the stakeholders, if there is any interest, can develop IoT labels. This is, of course, an instrument that will help towards building the trust around the IoT products and services. Last but not least, as well, since 2015, the Commission services are looking at redress mechanism in relation to safety and liability aspects. We already have acquis in place for that, but we are trying to identify what is the impact of these technologies on this acquis. So the Product Liability Directive is now under review, and we closely work with stakeholders to identify how can liabilities could be allocated in the realm of an IoT system. This goes beyond a device. Of course, I would like to mention that the aim behind all these activities is to make sure we bring added value in Europe. It's both for the consumers but as well for manufacturers, and that we channel our efforts towards meaningful innovation but as well competitive markets. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you all for your interventions, and I already have Million questions, but just to get a gauge from the audience, do you have immediate questions for the panelists or something you would like to add to what has been said or hasn't been said at this moment? No? You agree completely with what you have heard so far? I mean, excellent. Okay. There is a question in the back. Excellent. Okay, and in the front. I don't know if we have a microphone for the audience. I asked tentatively the tech team in the back. Is there no microphone? No mic. You will yell at me, and I will then say the question in the mic, I think, is how it will happen. So in the back, Maria? Okay, so for those who didn't hear the question, it was for Ana Maria who just spoke, and basically if she could also introduce the role of the free flow of data directive on the IoT environment.
Thank you very much for the question. So just to clarify the context, this directive, it's still a Commission proposal. We have put it forward last year in September. The main idea behind it's to make sure that that there are some rules in place also for non-personal data. Although the scope of the free flow of data proposal was also supposed to include personal data, in the negotiation process within the Commission services, we have managed to somehow circumvent the scope only in relation to non-personal data. Given that there are new rules in place on how to share and transfer this type of data, we believe that this proposal is going to, of course, facilitate development of cloud computing technologies. It's going to, of course, lift data localization restrictions in the member states. This is basically the main aim of the directive. And finally, we hope that this proposal, if accepted by the European Parliament and the Council, will, of course, go towards creating a framework for the establishment of a data economy. This is the main objective behind this proposal. And given the proposal is now within the Council, we expect stakeholders to bring input on the draft text in the next negotiation phases. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. And I'll take the question from Joanna up here as well while we're at it. Ooh. That's excellent.
See, thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for the panel. I find it deeply interesting. Thank you for this setup. I wanted to ask detailed questions that were given the answers to by Ana Maria, so I'm not going to ask those questions because I was going to ask about the Commission's approach. But what I would like to hear is the response to that Commission's approach, because my understanding is, first of all, the NIS directive draws a line when it comes to software developers, right? So when we're speaking about protecting critical infrastructure or infrastructure as such, software developers are not directly addressed. I would like to hear from the panel their responses to that approach. And partially the answer lies in what Ana Maria already discussed, because it's co-regulation, right? So it's supposed to be co-regulation rather than regulation from the Commission. And again, I would like to hear from the civil society, from academia, and from business, whether this is the desired approach, if it's working, or if you have any recommendations to improve that process. I know it's certification, self-regulation, et cetera, but I would like to hear from the panelists their assessment of the current state of affairs. Thank you.
Yep, and I would, yeah, you guys can take the question as you wish. I definitely imagine Chris will have some response.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think on the NIS directive, to fully understand the way that we see it, that working, I mean, of course, it still impacts the software, right? Because it's not trying to be a liability directive. It's trying to address the use of the equipment and the software in particular operational environments. And the operational environments that they're targeting is, leave aside the DSPs for a second, is primarily critical infrastructure, right? So I see that as actually very relevant. And it's certainly a conversation that we already have. So we've got customers all over the critical infrastructure space. And we do have that discussion already, even though NIS isn't fully implemented, around exactly how we're going to carry through some of the security requirements about this. What I would say that NIS is not, it's not really about product security per se though, right? It's primarily around information security, having the right processes in place that you adopt throughout the company. And of course that does have an impact on the product, but it's not a direct side. In terms of the product piece, I think the gap here is around perhaps doing the IoT trust label, where you can actually address the device manufacturers in situ. Now, one thing I do agree with Leonie in saying is, unfortunately, most of the discussions around this so far, including in Germany, which probably has the most advanced actual government discussions and guidelines around this, focus down on the device, and they don't consider it in its wider ecosystem. They don't consider the role that the network can play along this. And we can go into why that's so important, but I absolutely agree with Leonie that that really is fundamental for understanding the security. Just lastly, on the free flow question, look, I mean, I think it's a great piece of legislation. It shows a good intent, and it's covering a grey area which is there right now. Simply that we didn't know where the overlap was going to go between, say, health data and personal data, which was lex specialis. We didn't know, right? So it's definitely useful. But I would bear in mind that it is also limited, right? It does have a big carve-out for national security, and it also essentially has a carve-out for any self-provided IT services within the public sector, which in somewhere like Germany is their entire public sector. So just beware where the limits are there.
Yeah, and I wonder, Lukasz, do you want to add on further, or Ailidh, did you want to respond to that as well? No. If you wanted to add on about the software liability and some of the issues with that?
In relation to what? In relation to repeat, please.
Yeah.
Repeat, please.
Oh, sorry, about software liability and how to regulate this?
You mean standardization of the security privacy in the software development life cycle?
Yes.
Well,
microphone.
Well, so currently there is, in general, well, there are still issues with the integrating security with software development lifecycle. Like you have very popular products that are being shipped to market without any basic security guarantees. So let alone speaking about privacy, which should also be integrated with the software development lifecycle, as well as standardization. As per regulation, you cannot actually say that they incentivize any or motivate for creating software or systems with security or privacy by design or like baking in. I recall one meeting, e-privacy meeting, in a round table. There was one person who said that consent requirements in the e-privacy regulation proposal should be even more relaxed because Internet of Things devices cannot easily ask user for consent. This is of course not true, and it's a matter of design, but it's because of this kind of approach there are so many issues and so many problems with data management. So let's also say that the actual proposal of the Commission for the, I'm speaking about your Cybersecurity Act, which it's pretty underwhelming, and people should seriously discuss, and I hope that European Parliament will discuss this, whether certification shouldn't be mandatory. Like 90% of Europeans, consumers, actually think that there should be some basic security and privacy requirements as mandated by regulations, but the regulators aren't responding.
Yep, that's great. Yep, please.
Okay, so I'm speaking from the research perspective, and so what we have seen in the discussions, both in the practitioners' literature as well as in the academic literature, in regards to, for example, software liability, which is like a really tricky topic because I can see CISCO cringe, but what the majority of consensus is. So IoT as it is now is this like responsive, like it's not really like as full-blown automation as we will see like in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So in that regard, now it's the argument is that liability can still be contractually fully achieved. However, when we have AI systems, machine learning systems, etc., then it will become problematic, because then you can basically say, well, who fed the data into the system to make these decisions, and then who is liable? Because CISCO will say, well, that wasn't us. Sorry, I should know this. Or another company will say that. So. So that's the difficulty. However, having said so, I think like there are discussions and there are some, I would say there is a need for clarification, and I think the European Commission, at least from my perspective, from what I've read from the publications, is willing to provide more guidance and more policy strategic thinking around like certain things that are in the current product liability directive that are not applicable to IoT, like movable products. You know, we come back to this question: what is a product when it's a system, and like what is a defect? Is that like is a software vulnerability a defect, etc. So if we provide guidance for this transition period, I think we perhaps are fine. But when market failure arises, I think also the Commission will realize that they have to intervene. Having said so, I think from our analysis on the international developments, a market-led approach is currently purely driven. So the industry should sit down, and IoT is one aspect and one example of that, where industry actors who work in IoT are sitting down together and thinking about standards, thinking about best practices, thinking about guidelines. So currently this is primarily pushed, and the reason for that is simply because it's an evolving market, and nobody wants to stifle innovation. This, again, doesn't mean that there is no need to keep an open eye out for market failures, and we see them slowly arising with like issues around like children protection when it comes to IoT devices that spy on children, etc. So this is something we simply need to keep looking at, and when it really happens, then we really just perhaps software liability will be the place. One last point, and then I swear stop. When it comes to network questions around security, I highly recommend like looking at the GSMA IoT security guidelines for network security guidelines. So there is already stuff out there, so for people to and for manufacturers to draw upon. But all these additional measures, as long as they are done in a consistent manner, that like also like small medium-sized companies are able to follow these processes, I think there's potential there. So.
Yeah, I think there's a few of us in the room who are comfortable stifling innovation for a little bit, just to figure out the answers to some of these questions. You know, it's that ever-present question of just because it can be built, should it be built? And I think that's something we see ourselves asking right now in our research, and I'm sure in Privacy International's research too. You know, is this a moving train? Can we stop it? And I know that the line is we shouldn't, but perhaps we should put on the brakes a little bit. I know you had a response as well, so I'll let you go.
I wanted to pick up on the nature of the Cybersecurity Act, which indeed puts forward not mandatory certification, so it will all be voluntary based. Of course, when the Commission drafted the Act, the question was what kind of certification we want. We want to have it already mandatory, or we want to have a light approach. Of course, having in mind the GDPR regulation and all the process that had started towards doing steps for the implementation and guidelines, this we consider a strong tool to tackle privacy elements, and there are also redress mechanisms for data breaches there. And it is clear for us, in order to ensure the privacy dimension of a device or of an environment, there is clearly need to invest in the security of that. So somehow we consider the security dimension, but as well the right to life dimension, is somehow covered within the GDPR. That is why the approach for the voluntary certification scheme was finally the one we opted for, but as one of the interlocutors before mentioned, this is a co-regulation process. It is a very transparent process. We have all the time been involved with stakeholders, both on the industry and the consumer side, and it appeared that the voluntary scheme would be a first step. This does not preclude us in, of course, transforming the Cybersecurity Act into a mandatory certification. So let's take it as a step, as a first step. And in relation to the liability questions, I'd like to inform you that by the end of this half year in 2018, the evaluation of the product liability directive will come to an end. We have started this process already in 2016. So there you will find a first reflection of the Commission services on what is the impact of these emerging technologies. And now here we go beyond Internet of Things. We talk about artificial intelligence, but as well advanced robotics and other type of technologies, blockchain, 3D, so on and so forth. And a first legal analysis on the impact of these technologies in relation to the liability acquis will be put forward, and that would be a first step towards identifying, let's say, next ones.
Sorry, just to kind of echo what Lucie said there, I think there's privacy concerns, and privacy, as I said, does go beyond data protection. It goes beyond the definition of personal data as defined in GDPR. And I think there is that tension as to what's personal data and what's not personal data. And in that sense, we need to be careful, because that's not so. It's not so clearly defined, and there's room for different interpretations on that. And I think that therefore, looking at the free flow of non-personal data and things like that, I think we need to be really careful about what we're talking about, and also these frameworks in the sense of what options they have, the exemptions they have, and the carve-outs that they have as well.
This is like a self-moderating panel almost. It's fantastic. There is a question in the back, but since you've already asked one, I wonder if anyone else has a question to make, because then I would preference nay. Okay, then Maria, you can once again yell at me and I will translate into the microphone.
The question is still about the issue of liability. I particularly welcome the comment that was made earlier about the fact that liability is going to become very difficult with machine learning and artificial intelligence based systems. I was wondering whether there is a debate in the regulatory circles or among the people who work on this subject, whether in machine learning and artificial intelligence systems we could move towards an inverted burden of proof, meaning this could be either a hard version or a soft version. A soft version of the inverted burden of proof could be what the GDPR does. It means that the vendor would have to prove that they've done everything that was in their position to make sure that the system was safe and secure, or a hard liability would have to be that they had to fully demonstrate indeed that they took vast care possible. So I'm wondering if this is a discussion that is occurring, and if not, do you think it would be feasible, or do you think it could be the way forward?
Okay, so the question, just for those who couldn't hear, for the sake of the recording and for your sake, is basically about liability and how we manage that when we move towards machine learning and AI, and if there's a possibility, or if it's being discussed, to have this kind of inverted burden of proof, where a vendor would have to prove that they did everything in their power, basically, to mitigate the risks. Yeah, okay, great. Take it away.
So, if I understand correctly, you are asking whether it's a good idea to require a vendor to prove, or at least argue, that they did everything they could to make a system secure, right?
Well, in case there is a dispute, in case there is, in case damage has, in case there has been a security failure of some sort that has caused damage. So in case there is a dispute between a user and the vendor, it's not by default, it's not that they would have to prove that by default, but
So it's a matter of design. So it's a matter of design, right? Like, I mean, proving that they designed their thing. I mean, proving that they did a good job. Oh.
procedure, technical and organizational.
Yeah. Sure. So, First of all, no one wants to be held liable. So if there is a huge breach, the press will ask lawmakers, and they will just speak, and it's not their fault, and they will just put it under the carpet. Same for vendors, same for standardizers, same for implementers, same for service providers. Now, GDPR provides a requirement for risk assessment, right? But this risk assessment still should be someone needs to guarantee that this risk assessment is just not put on paper, that is actually being deployed, something is being followed, that standards are being made in a well-designed manner. And now, what you can do is, for example, requiring to publish a privacy impact assessment with some specific design step, like what did the vendor do in order to predict some kind of issues. That could be perceived as a way to actually address this kind of liability, that we actually did something. And when I say something, I do not mean something like anything, but something that by this I mean the right thing.
Yeah, Chris, if you want to respond.
So I think the first thing about liability is I don't see it as something fundamentally new, right? You know, if you look at the value chain on something like this phone, right? Just take that before you jump to AI or whatever. You've got the device manufacturer, you've got the components manufacturer behind that, you've got whoever created the operating system, you've got the app developers, you've got, when you break down the software, you've got modularized software which goes back to open source, which is created along the way, right? There's already multiple points along the chain. Now, what I do agree is that it will continue to get more complex. But I think the simple solution around this space, and why I don't think it's as complicated as people make out, is if you're talking about liability, you make the liable person the person who has a relationship with the user. And the rest you control with contractually back up in the value chain. You know, so who's liable? Well, you know, in this case, who sold me the phone? Yeah, Apple, there you go, fine. So that's why I think, you know, then you rely on the value chain sorting it out behind the scenes contractually. Now, I do want to say, though, I think that there's a little bit too much talk around the liability discussion. If you take a step back and say, what are you trying to solve for here? You're trying to make the devices or the ecosystems more secure, right? And I think on the one hand, if you look at certain user communities, they're really focused on this. They make you work for it, right? I mean, if we sell into critical infrastructure or government, you know, we've spent 30 million in the last few years on common criteria certifications for our products, right? You know, that involves all the independent testing, the whole piece beyond that. They want to get in the guts of our products where they're using them in those high-risk use case scenarios. At the same time, we offer a technology verification service. Any one of our customers can come and check out the device, the software behind it, in a controlled environment, right? So you can do that as well. Now, I guess you're going to say the risk case is more not those kind of really high-risk use cases. It's the everyday consumers which are out there. Now, I think on that side, at least when we put this in the context of IoT, this might sound controversial, but I think we should treat the devices like they are insecure. Right, you know, forget liability as the solution for OEMs producing, you know, some cheap connected toaster. I don't think, frankly, I don't trust that liability will change them or give them new incentives for how they go about that. And that's again why I come back to the idea of the IoT trust label and trying to push more the incentives more back up inside the network itself and how you handle at that base. And how you handle the automation. Obviously, you know, the security of the device does matter. I don't want to be facetious, but I would say that I think that's where the trend needs to go in order to make this more secure in the future.
Okay, if you have a quick point, I'll let you make it.
Yeah. Now, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that indeed this debate on somehow revising the current product liability regimes in light of these technologies is ongoing. There are first reflection in the Commission communication on building a European data economy, and there indeed we emphasize the fact that discharging the burden of proof in the case of a defective IoT device or ecosystem is indeed not easy, given that in light of the current rules we need to prove a damage, we need to prove the defect, and we also need to prove the damage between the link and the defect. But as I mentioned, a first reflection will come by the end of this year, and then we expect new inputs from you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I think Chris already touched upon something that I wanted to get to in the next point, and that's, you know, liability has a beginning and an end. And I actually think talking about just security liability really misses the point, because as a consumer, I mean, and we all work sort of within this sphere, there's no such thing as a secure device, right? So I think this is kind of chasing a certain uncertainty. But I wonder what liability means for the end user in that case. And actually what I think we should start thinking about is more of the data collection liability. You know, what exactly is the data that's being collected? How is it being processed? You know, when CISCO works with third-party software and third-party contractors, which you do for a lot of your projects, where does your liability for that lie? You know, things like data minimization. Are you really collecting only everything you need for that particular function? And are you doing enough to give user that power to either erase or modify or the data as they need, you know? So I think we need to go, and I think NIST went that way. It went after the security of infrastructure, but I think we need to start going after liability. Well, yeah, you know, if Uber is collecting my location data every time and it's storing it for 5 years, I don't care if I don't care about the security being breached. I care about why they took my data and kept it for 5 years, you know? So that's a failing of the data collection. So I wonder what your perspectives are on that, and we can do a round. And you want to...
Over collection.
Yeah.
Sure. So it's actually very related to GDPR, because GDPR requires processors, systems, software, processes to follow privacy by design. One of the fundamental, well, actually maybe not fundamental, but one of the integral parts or strategies that one can follow is data minimization. So in order to actually demonstrate that privacy by design is being followed, data protection by design is being followed, you need to show that you do not collect something that you do not actually need. And when you do, you still provide some settings where the user has a control over what is being collected. In that sense, you have a liability thanks to the GDPR fines. On the other hand, in general, you'd expect something for motivation, like motivation from certificates, motivation from fines. I mean, just to follow the good standards. In the end, still, I think it will take years before industry will actually adopt this data minimization strategy.
Okay, and that tiny little Tinkerbell means that we have 5 minutes left, so brief.
No, I've been taking way too much.
No, just to echo that in terms of there's this inherent tension, you know, that data minimization is a core principle of the GDPR and also for the law enforcement directive as well. And it's extremely important to, you know, be able to demonstrate how you're complying with that. And that is something that needs to be thought out in all of these discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a conversation this morning with our America's data protection officer, and he comes from an engineering background, not from a legal background, and he was quite interested in the way that he's trying to think about data minimization in our company, for example. And what he said, look, the big challenge is that engineers want to keep everything. Right? The natural instinct of the product development teams is grab the data, find out what you're going to do with it later. And he said, you know, of course there's the legal framework. And I want to say just clearly that GDPR has been great for improving the privacy culture inside companies. Whatever anyone else says, it's been a huge incentive to treat this more seriously and put more resources behind it. But it's behind, let's say, it still feels relatively new as something that we take seriously right to the core, to the design of the products. And I think what his experience is in trying to make this work is that you have to embed this principle in terms of how you use privacy by design, right in the existing processes that exist around secure development lifecycle, because that's far more common. You know, everyone does their secure development lifecycle. So instead of trying to create something parallel, how do you actually put that in place along the way? And that's the path that he's been on. In terms of the threats going forward, in terms of too much, you know, everyone's getting more and more sophisticated data lakes. They're sitting on more data. A lot of it's connecting up to a greater extent. So, you know, that's the big challenge. How do you try and address that? If you've already got the data, you know, it's quite hard to go through and delete it all out. So you have to think a lot about also about access. You know, what is the ability to control and understand who can access when? And that starts with policy, and you have to work through from there.
Is that the final statements or just the product liability still?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Is it the final statements or is it still on product liability?
Well, I'm going to need you to do both, and I'm going to need you to do it real quick.
Okay, okay. So I just wanted to say on product liability one small thing. It's really important that product liability is purely about damage. Okay, so when we talk about data, that is not yet really part of product liability as it is now, and that's why we need to discuss how we move forward with that. So damage is like if I hurt you and the toaster burns you, that's damage to you and the property. So that was on the product liability. I wanted to bring back the whole discussion also to the question around bodies in the internet, and I think like we have talked a lot about like the risks, less about the opportunities of IoT, because I know that this is like a really important concern that like academics, practitioners, etc. need to currently engage with. But I think like one aspect I think we also need to focus on is like kind of the impact these devices and systems will have on especially vulnerable groups. So I think like that these debates need to also be discussed in light of these communities. So for example, I'm looking currently also on issues around like victims of domestic violence and abuse, how this could potentially harm them further, but also like actually help them in receiving help when needed. But this is like up in the air and very forward looking. And I think that's actually what is needed currently in these debates. Not the discussion about what is currently being purchased and used, our Fitbits, our smart toasters, our smart kettles, but actually the really big challenges start like in like 5 to 10 years onwards, when we have those fully interconnected systems that do all their things themselves, and we just tell them one thing and then they go on. And I think that is like forward-thinking, future foresight ideas is actually really important in these debates. Yeah, that's my...
Thank you. So to combine both questions, the final remarks and the product liability debates, I would just like to highlight the fact that these emerging technologies, among which Internet of Things, come with specificities that disturb our current acquis in relation to safety, in relation to privacy, in relation to liabilities, and on this, I refer to high levels of complexity and interdependencies between the different components in the value chain, about increasing autonomy of the resulting goods, which is products and services, the dependence on data, and a strong digital dimension with more intangible virtual elements than tangible ones. So this means we have a lot of work ahead. We need to properly study the impact of these specificities on these acquis and come up with proper results to make sure there is innovation and that the rights of consumers are protected and there is added value in Europe. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think we managed exactly. I hear the clapping from the next room.
Well, unless there was some few sentences.
How many of you want to go rush right out and buy a smart fridge? Well, there's one everywhere. Thank you so much for being here. I guess we all go to see the Casper Bowden panel now. Or is that later? Isn't that 4? Oh no, we have coffee first. Coffee! Thank you.
Thank you.